Now then, let's focus on the bigger picture across the continent. The COVID-19 pandemic has cut employment in sub-Saharan economies by over 8%. It's also returned 32 million people back into extreme poverty just last year. Now, those are some of the headline numbers in the latest review of the region's economic performance by the International Monetary Fund. It does make for fairly grim reading. In the early days of the pandemic, the fund forecast a contraction of 3.2%. It now estimates that the contraction that took place last year was just 1.9%, with the second half of the year being salvaged by a better than expected performance in sectors like agriculture, which were not as hard hit by the pandemic. Now, the number of countries at high risk of debt distress, though, is concerning. That has tripled from 2014 to 2020. Zambia, of course, does continue to default on its Eurobonds after the initial default last October. As the size of the job market in many economies in the region has contracted and net earnings are falling, governments have an increasingly smaller and smaller pool of funds available to stay ahead of debt service obligations. Earlier on, I spoke to the head of the IMF's Africa department, Abebe Selassie. I started our conversation by asking him why it will take years in some countries just to get back to where they were in 2019.
We estimate that growth last year contracted for Sub-Saharan Africa as a whole by 2%. This is by far the worst record, the worst on record that we can find. Now, it's slightly better than what we were hearing would happen, a contraction of around 3%, so minus 2% is still the worst, but somewhat better. This year looks like playing off the recovery that we're seeing in the rest of the world, and of course the easing of restrictions in our region. Also, the economic output should expand by about 3.5%. Still very anemic by our region standards. But perhaps more telling is really the incredibly awful effect that it has had on by pushing back some 30 million people back into extreme poverty in our region. Job losses we estimate of around 8% of jobs, and these are spread around the economy. Sectors that are heavily tourism dependent have been affected greatly, of course, but also there's a lot of effects on the informal activities. So really very broad hit to our economies and our people.
That 100 basis point delta you're talking about between the original forecast of a contraction of 3% and what we actually saw in 2020, that 1.9% contraction, was that essentially because we saw a recovery in some of the large economies and of course driven in part perhaps by the recovery in commodity prices as well for economies like Nigeria?
Yes, I mean the second half was somewhat better than we had expected. That was particularly the case in some of the larger economies, which, given their size, also tend to have a big effect on the regional aggregate. Less commodities and a bit more sectors like agriculture, which thankfully, have been spared somewhat by the hit that COVID has had in more urban areas, in more service and manufacturing type activities.
One of the other things that stood out for me was the fact that you're arguing that we might be back to where we were in terms of or per capita income only after 2022, in some countries much later on, 2023, 2025. Walk us through how that scenario was arrived at.
So, as always, Sub-Saharan Africa, of course, it's extremely heterogeneous, extremely differentiated economies within that, right? And what we are, the way we prepare our forecast is looking at country by country projections, and we see a very diverse picture here. For the region as a whole, it will not be until well into next year before per capita income reverts back to the 2019 level. But within that overall picture, it's quite, there's quite a lot of differentiation. And what's worrisome is that there are 13 countries where per capita income will not return to 2019 levels until 2025. And that's about 350 million people that live in these countries. So really quite a big share of the region's population is not going to go back to enjoying the same standards of living for a few years yet. Of course, there are also some economies that are going to be set to rebound this year and reach 2019 per capita income levels as quickly as this year, and it will, but it's still a very differentiated picture and a worrisome picture because there is going to be some drag from the effects of this pandemic.